Inflation is rising, interest rates are rising, the stock market has crashed, crypto has crashed, and the housing bubble is about to burst. I'm gonna buy when it crashes. Unless you're a cash buyer, I'm calling BS on that one. Are you one of those people who have said that I'm gonna wait for a property crash before I buy? If you are, have you really thought that out? Does the logic follow true? And is it a good idea? Perhaps it's a good idea if you're a cash investor, you don't need to rent anywhere, and you're able to invest your money somewhere that gives you a better return than inflation right now. If you're trying to buy a family home and get a mortgage, is it worth the risk? Is it worth the gamble that the market will crash? There's always going to be people to tell you the market's going to rise or crash. If you are one of those people who are saying the market's going to crash every single year, you are going to be right at least one in every 7 or 10 years. But how much should the possibility of a potential crash influence your decision to buy now if you need or want to buy a family home? I put out a video last year and asked the question, is it worth waiting for a crash? In that video, I suggested it wasn't worth waiting, and if you wanted a family home, you should buy now. Since then, residential property prices have increased by about 14 or 15%. Inflation has been attacking cash savings, and interest rates have got higher, and cost of borrowing has become more expensive. If you're also renting during that period, you could be down an additional 20 or 30K. And if you held off buying last year because you thought there was going to be a crash, you could be down about 100K, if not more. But is it still a good idea to wait for a market crash now? The risk of a market downturn is definitely higher. Interest rates are higher. We have had a number of stock market dips, and generally speaking, the real estate market will dip about 6 to 9 months after there's been a stock market dip. So a fall in prices is definitely on the cards in the near future. So let's weigh up some factors. Over the last 100 years, the majority of years have resulted in property price increases. Years of increases are far more common than years of declines. So most years, the odds are in favor or stacked in favor of property price increases. It is extremely uncommon for prices to fall more than 10% in any single year. If a major crash was to happen, it would take years to get to the bottom. The 2008 crash took 5 years to get to the bottom. So if you are hoping for a crash like 2008, let's outline what you're really hoping for. Are you prepared for renting for the next 5 years until the market hits the bottom? And don't forget to factor in the cost of renting during those 5 years as well. Are you also prepared for the unemployment and misery such a crash will bring about, as well as the much stricter lending rules that will be in place? The majority of people were not able to get a mortgage between 2009 and 2014 in the last crash. The likelihood it will happen again, and getting a mortgage will be extremely difficult. If you are hoping a crash will bring about increased supply or funds selling off some of their properties, the exact opposite will happen. Supply was extremely limited in the last crash, and developers also stopped building. The same would happen again. Developers won't take on the risk of developing any further projects, and existing homeowners won't be forced to sell because they're not heavily leveraged at the moment, and banks won't force them to sell anytime soon. So supply will actually get worse. The notion that a crash will force international property funds to sell off some of their properties to owner-occupiers and open up more supply is just plain wrong. These funds are not heavily leveraged. They generally have timed exit strategies, and most of these funds are set up for 7 to 10 year cycles. If market data does trigger some forced sales, they won't be selling these apartment blocks to owner occupiers. They'll be selling the blocks to other funds with different risk criteria. If a crash or a downturn does happen, supply of new homes will also slow down because developers won't take on additional risk in starting new schemes. Even if a major crash was to happen and you were to buy now, what is the real risk? Would you be worse off? If you hadn't have bought, you'd still be renting somewhere, perhaps at 20 or 30K a year, and perhaps paying off a mortgage might be more beneficial for you. If a downturn did last 5 years, you're renting for 5 years, you're also 5 years older, which could impact you and your ability to borrow because you may not be able to get a 30-year mortgage anymore. The chances of a major crash like 2008 are slim. They're not impossible, but they are slim. If you're going to gamble that a crash will happen, that is what you're doing. You're taking a gamble and you're taking your risk. You're risking paying rent while you're sitting on the fence, and you're also risking that property prices won't go up any further. The odds for a major crash happening right now are extremely low, and you're gambling on the long shot. The favorite right now is probably that prices will go up slightly this year, followed closely by a stable price, and I think in the chasing pack, and perhaps might get it at the very end, is a slight reduction. However, a major crash is a furlong back in 2022. The situation is going to be different for everyone, but I just think it's important to consider the other costs associated with waiting for the crash, and consider the amount of a property price fall that would actually make it that wait worthwhile. Are you paying rent of $30,000 a year? What price reduction makes it worth paying that rent every year and sitting on the fence? Perhaps it's a 10% or a 5% reduction in property prices that make it actually worthwhile for you. I'm not suggesting that everyone should run out and buy right now. Far from it. I think right now is not the ideal time to buy. All I'm saying is that if you do want to buy a house and you need to buy a house, but you are waiting on the fence for a property crash, perhaps you need to consider some other options or other costs to that wait as well. Also, renting might be a far better option for many people. It gives a lot of flexibility, and also you don't have to commit a huge amount of capital to it either. All I'm really trying to say is if you're trying to buy a property, waiting or trying to time a crash comes with its own risk as well. If you are a cash buyer and you don't need to rent, then perhaps the situation is a little bit different. Perhaps it's worth your while taking a gamble that a crash will happen, assuming that you are able to find an investment tool that can protect you against inflation while you are waiting. If you ever want to reach out to me, contact details are below, including a link to my Instagram, and there is a link there to subscribe to our monthly newsletter, which includes some market data and market facts and figures. And before anyone comments on this video that I have a vested interest in keeping property prices high, I don't sell residential property, and I have no vested interest whatsoever in keeping property prices high, other than the fact that I own a property, but I don't intend to sell that for 20 years or more. Please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel, and as always, thanks for watching.